There he stands under the flashbulbs of a Los Angeles premiere in the late 1980s, and the photograph could hardly be more polished. Tailored jacket, collar cut just so, hair thick and pushed into that careless wave that no one's hair ever really achieves by accident. The horn-rimmed frames sit at the perfect distance from the camera. He is smiling, a half smile, confident, practiced. The kind of smile a man learns when he knows exactly how long a lens needs him. He looks like he was born to a certain kind of room in a certain kind of Boston house. Then you reach his eyes. Something in them refuses the rest of the picture. They are distant, cool, faintly amused in a way that does not include you. They look like the eyes of a man watching a conversation from across the room and finding the whole performance mildly exhausting. You cannot quite place him. He looks like he belongs there and at the same time looks like he has walked onto the wrong set and decided to stay anyway. That is the paradox the entire career would eventually be built on. The perfect tuxedo worn by a man whose gaze never quite bought into the tuxedo. James Todd Spader was born on February 7, 1960 in Boston, into a world that treated ideas as currency and language as a kind of blade. Both his parents were educators. His father ran a prestigious college preparatory school in the city, the kind of address that arrives embossed on the front of a folder. In the family home, evenings were not for idle chatter. They were for argument, for books passed across the table with a finger marking a passage, for the careful, almost athletic use of words. To grow up in that house was to understand early that a sentence could be a small, elegant weapon, and that thinking clearly was a moral obligation. From that kind of training, the boy who would later become known for unsettling audiences on screen emerged calm, self-possessed, sharp. By the time he reached his teenage years, the world outside had already begun to take notice. He was sent to Phillips Academy in Andover, not a school so much as a machine finely calibrated to produce the country's future leaders, judges, senators, financiers. The hallways were lined with portraits of men who ran things. The classrooms pressed forward toward Ivy League acceptance letters and quiet, inherited influence. While he was there, he became friends with John F. Kennedy Jr., the son of the late president, the boy whose very name guaranteed a future that almost wrote itself. To the teachers, the admissions officers, to anyone glancing at the trajectory of that young life, it must have seemed inevitable. The right family, the right school, the right friends, the right path. Then, at 17, still in his junior year, James Spader did something the machine was not designed to accommodate. He dropped out. To the classmates around him still grinding toward prestigious universities, it must have looked like quiet self-destruction. To him, on the other hand, the decision felt strangely simple. No textbook, no lecture, no mahogany-paneled classroom was ever going to teach him how to stand in front of a camera and become another person. So he packed his belongings, left the stone buildings and the leafy paths of Andover behind, and boarded a bus for New York. The city that received him had no interest in his last name or his father's title. It had rent to collect, subways to run, winters that did not apologize. To keep the dream alive while the dream refused to pay him back, the young man took whatever work he could find. He stood behind a bar late into the night, shaking cocktail mixers until his arm ached. On freezing winter evenings, he hauled heavy cargo out of railroad cars, his breath turning to small clouds in the yellow lamps of the yard. He drove a meat delivery truck through the narrow, impatient streets of the city, learning the layout of the avenues the way other young men were learning conjugations. He worked as a stable hand at a New York stable, shoveling horse manure with a patience that did not belong on the face of a future leading man. Somewhere in the margins of all that labor, he also taught yoga at a Manhattan studio, a small, strange fact that says more about the texture of his survival years than any Hollywood profile ever would. It was at that yoga studio that he met Victoria Keel, an interior designer who was also working there. The years were lean and unforgiving, and the bond between them formed during exactly that kind of weather. They married in 1987, would go on to have 2 sons, and would eventually part ways in 2004. But that is a later chapter. In the moment, what mattered was that in the middle of manure and cocktails and frozen railroad yards, a partnership had quietly taken root. Then came the break that arrived in the most unglamorous container imaginable, a mop. While he was still scraping by, Spader took a janitorial job at a theater workshop not far from Times Square. The workshop was run by a man named Trent Goff, an acting teacher and casting director who made it his business to notice people, whether they were on stage or behind a bucket. Goff noticed this particular janitor. The work clothes were stained, the mop was ordinary, and yet something about the young man kept breaking through. A quality of attention, an intelligence that did not switch off when the scrubbing started. A gaze unusually steady for someone whose official job title did not call for any kind of gaze at all. Goff took an interest. Through that interest, the first professional acting opportunities began to drift toward a man who, until very recently, had been unreachable through any normal casting channel. In 1981, at the age of 20, Spader landed his first officially credited film role. The film was Endless Love, directed by Franco Zeffirelli, a glossy, romantic drama built around Brooke Shields in her early stardom. Spader was cast as Keith Butterfield, the brother of her character. It was a small supporting role, brief appearances, a handful of lines, the kind of credit that barely makes it onto a poster. On screen, he was credited modestly as Jimmy Spader, the family nickname that had followed him since childhood in Boston. Almost no one noticed the work. And yet, in the long view, that minor credit was the first quiet brick laid in a foundation that would eventually carry more weight than anyone in the room that day could have predicted. By the early 1980s, the particular terrain of Hollywood that awaited him had already been claimed by a very specific generation. This was the era of the Brat Pack, young actors roughly his age, with the same soft features, the same easy hair, the same talent for making audiences fall a little in love with them over the course of a single date scene. They were the lovable boys next door, the romantic mistakes you forgive, the charming disasters you wanted to take home for the weekend. The industry had a template, and it worked beautifully on the young men who fit it. The trouble was that James Spader did not fit it. He had all the surface accessories, the jawline, the cheekbones, the frame that photographs well, and yet something in his presence refused to play the part of the approachable hero. Even in his earliest auditions, even before he had the credits to prove it, there was a quality to him that the camera noticed immediately. A stillness that did not invite affection, an intelligence that arrived with its own weather system. He looked too cold, too knowing, too sharp around the edges to be anyone's leading man dream. And so, standing at the threshold of his professional life, holding in one hand a mop that had recently been his livelihood, and in the other hand a one-line credit as Jimmy Spader, he faced a choice. He could try to sand down the edges of himself until he fit the template the town had already prepared. Or he could let the camera keep noticing that particular stillness and see where it led. Anyone who has ever watched his career unfold already knows which way he turned. But in that moment, in the early 1980s, with the Brat Pack already occupying the warm center of the culture and the cold-eyed newcomer still technically unnamed, the decision was not at all obvious. It was, in fact, a kind of wager, one made quietly, by a young man whose Boston upbringing had taught him never to confuse polish with substance, and whose survival years in New York had taught him that the only comfort worth trusting is the kind you build with your own hands. The wager would not pay off immediately. The town had a particular idea of what it wanted from a handsome young man, and his wager was essentially to refuse that idea at every turn. For that refusal, he was about to be tested in ways that had nothing to do with talent and everything to do with patience, with waiting, with the willingness to be misread for years before the world finally caught up with the script he had been carrying all along. The question that the next decade would answer, slowly, reluctantly, sometimes angrily, was simple. Was there room, in the bright and shiny machinery of Hollywood, for a performer who refused to smile on command, who could not be warmed up by a love interest, and whose idea of charm was to make an audience lean forward in discomfort rather than melt in relief? The coming years would show exactly how much room there was, and exactly how much trouble that room could cause. Hollywood in the early 1980s had a simple instruction manual for a young man who looked like James Spader. Find him a sidekick role, give him a love interest, place him next to the female lead, and let the chemistry do the rest. The script was already written, the set was already dressed. All he had to do was walk in and be the kind of handsome the audience wanted to take home. Spader walked in and did something else entirely. He used that same handsome face as a kind of trap. He played characters audiences disliked on sight, sometimes within a single scene, and yet could not stop watching. The pattern began to lock into place almost immediately. In Mannequin, he played a scheming, shameless assistant manager, The kind of small, well-dressed villain who lies for a living and never raises his voice. In Tough Turf, he took the role of a wealthy antagonist, gliding into someone else's story with a smirk that promised nothing good. Each role was small. Each role was carefully, almost surgically unpleasant. The industry's casting directors started to see a pattern they could use, and they used it. By the middle of the decade, the offers arriving at his door were nearly identical. Spoiled young men, ruthless young men who treated the people around them as furniture. Then, in 1986, came the role that would pin him to that image forever. Pretty in Pink cast him as Steph, a privileged private school student whose idea of entertainment was the casual destruction of anyone who wandered into his orbit. There was no shouting, no fists, no obvious violence. Steph's cruelty arrived through intelligence, through an aristocratic contempt that he wielded like a family heirloom. He picked people apart in conversations. He made cruelty look like a clever hobby. Audiences across the country walked out of the theater furious at him and somehow unable to forget him. That sly half smile, the one that said he was 3 moves ahead of everyone in the room, became one of the most recognizable images of the decade. The film industry quickly learned what to do with that face. In Less Than Zero, he played a cold-blooded drug dealer whose quietness made the violence around him feel even worse. In Wall Street, he took on the role of a cunning broker who wore a suit the way other people wore armor. Within just a few years, a very specific box had been built around him, and the box had his name on it. Hollywood had decided what James Spader was for. What nobody had decided yet was what he might become. In 1989, a young director named Steven Soderbergh, only 25 years old at the time, walked into the slow-moving machinery of independent American cinema with a script and almost no money. The film was called Sex, Lies, and Videotape, and Soderbergh had roughly $1.2 million to make it. He cast Spader as Graham Dalton, an eccentric, emotionally troubled man who could only experience intimacy by recording women talking about their personal sexual lives on video. It was the kind of role most leading men would have returned to sender without opening the envelope. Spader opened it. He played Graham with the precision of a watchmaker. Every breath was measured. Every silence was placed on screen with the same care other actors reserve for their big speeches. He turned a character that could easily have been a cartoon into a quietly devastating human being. The film traveled to the Cannes Film Festival, where it did not politely arrive so much as detonate. Sex, Lies, and Videotape won the Palme d'Or, the highest prize in world cinema. James Spader, at 29 years old, walked away with the award for Best Actor. In a single night, the box that Hollywood had built around him collapsed on the floor. He was no longer just a recognizable face who played unpleasant men in expensive supporting roles. He was a serious actor of the highest possible caliber, recognized by the most demanding judges in the international film community. He had also, almost without noticing, helped open the door to a new golden era of American independent cinema. A whole generation of low-budget films, strange scripts, and unlikely casting would soon follow in the wake of what he and Soderbergh had just done. For most actors, a Cannes prize of that size is a passport. A few months of smart choices and the phone starts ringing with offers for the biggest productions in town. Spader looked at the passport and walked the other way. He seemed to view the award not as a launch pad toward box office glory, but as permission, a kind of license to keep making unusual choices, to keep inhabiting morally ambiguous characters who made audiences uncomfortable and fascinated at the same time. That instinct produced a string of roles through the early 1990s that, taken together, looked like a quiet manifesto. In White Palace, he played a young widower with a disciplined life who became entangled with an older working-class waitress, a story about the strange ways grief reshapes desire. In Bad Influence and in Dream Lover, he moved through territory that had to do with obsession, paranoia, and the unsettling vulnerability of being manipulated by someone who knows you too well. None of these were studio-safe bets. All of them suggested an actor uninterested in repeating himself. Then came the year 1994, and with it, a chance to take the safe road. The German-born director Roland Emmerich invited Spader to play the linguist Daniel Jackson in the science fiction adventure Stargate, alongside Kurt Russell. The role was intelligent, curious, deeply human. A scholar navigating a rigid military environment, asking questions the soldiers around him had stopped asking. The film was a hit, earning close to $200 million at the worldwide box office. It is exactly the kind of result that turns an actor into a franchise. Spader treated it like a layover at an airport he had never planned to live in. He moved on almost immediately, returning to the kind of scripts that asked more of him and offered less in return. The second half of the 1990s became the boldest stretch of his film work to that point. In 1996, he joined forces with the Canadian director David Cronenberg on Crash, a film so controversial it was banned in several jurisdictions for its disturbing subject matter. Spader played a television producer who becomes drawn into a strange group seeking physical fulfillment through violent automobile collisions. It was the kind of role an agent would plead with a client to set down gently and walk away from. Spader approached it with complete seriousness, emotional restraint, and a remarkably practical mindset. He did not signal that he was above the material. He did not wink at the audience to let them know the project was beneath him. He simply played the role as honestly as he could, and in doing so made the entire film even more unsettling than it would otherwise have been. He proved again that his craft could outrun any controversy surrounding a script. 6 years later, in 2002, he accepted the role of the attorney E. Edward Gray in Secretary, the story of a disciplined, controlling employer whose relationship with his young secretary becomes intertwined with sadomasochistic tendencies. It would have been very easy to play the character as a cardboard villain, a textbook abuser with a leather desk set. Through Spader's performance, the character became something more complicated and more human. He revealed vulnerability, caution, deeply buried emotional wounds. He used silence, deliberate pacing, subtle glances to transform a sensitive subject into something that felt, against all reason, like an authentic love story. The role earned him some of the most thoughtful reviews of his career and announced, once again, that he had no interest in doing what the industry expected of him. By the end of the 20th century, the pattern was unmistakable. A face built for leading man posters, a refusal of every leading man convention, a growing list of characters who did not belong in a date movie, who rarely laughed easily, who walked into a scene and reorganized the temperature of the room simply by standing still. Cannes had crowned him. Cronenberg had tested him. A romantic comedy without the comedy had revealed new layers in him. Hollywood, by this point, knew exactly what it had in James Spader, and it did not know what to do with him. For decades, the most powerful people in American entertainment had insisted that this particular combination of qualities could not survive translation to the small screen. The argument was familiar, and almost no one in a suit disagreed with it. Audiences, the executives said, would pay for a movie ticket to watch James Spader play villains in the dark. They would not invite that same unsettling presence into the comfort of their living room. His intelligence did not project as warm. His stillness did not feel cozy. His eyes, the ones that everyone had been photographing since the late 1980s, simply did not belong in a medium built around the assumption that the audience and the performer are old friends. There was, however, one person in the industry who did not entirely agree with the consensus. The acclaimed writer and producer David E. Kelley had been searching for an actor to play a new attorney character named Alan Shore in the 8th season of his legal drama, The Practice. Kelley wanted Spader. The network's executives did not. The argument inside the room went exactly the way you would expect. Viewers, the executives insisted, want comfort when they sit down after dinner. Spader would make them lean forward instead of lean back. He would make them think when they wanted to laugh. He would, in a phrase nobody quite said out loud, ruin the evening. Kelley pushed. Kelley used the kind of influence that only comes from years of hits and a reputation you cannot simply replace. The executives relented. Spader was cast. The role was a lawyer with a razor-sharp tongue who treated the law like an intellectual game and was always willing to bend the moral rules if the bending was interesting enough. Alan Shore was a character built almost entirely out of the qualities the executives had been afraid of. He was intelligent in a way that made the jury lean in. He was disarming in a way that never quite reached comfortable. He was the kind of role that, on paper, should have failed on network television. Reality delivered a spectacular blow to the conservative thinking of every executive in that meeting. Audiences did not switch the channel. They welcomed him in. They became captivated. The character of Alan Shore was such a complete, immediate success that the following year, Spader was awarded the Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama Series. The network did something it almost never does for a character introduced so late in a series. It built an entirely new spin-off around him. The new show was called Boston Legal, and it ran from 2004 to 2008, largely because Spader was in it. Alongside the veteran William Shatner, who played the gloriously eccentric Denny Crane, Spader created one of the most unusual on-screen friendships in television history. Two deeply flawed men, proud and arrogant on the surface, the only two people in the world truly capable of understanding each other. For 4 straight seasons, audiences invited that friendship into their living rooms night after night. The performance was so consistent, so recognizable across both shows, that it earned an almost unheard-of distinction. 3 Emmy Awards in 4 years for the same character, carried across 2 different television series, a record that quietly dismantled every assumption Hollywood had ever made about where James Spader belonged, and proved that the medium the executives had feared would reject him had, in fact, been waiting for him all along. The television miracle of Boston Legal should have been the quiet, dignified peak. 3 Emmys in 4 years for the same character carried across 2 shows, a reputation that no longer needed defending, a place firmly set at the top of any list of America's most distinctive screen actors. Most performers, having crossed that finish line, would have softened their schedules, taken on safer projects, and let the legend settle like dust on a polished surface. James Spader did what he always did. He treated the success as a fresh supply of oxygen, and went back into rooms the industry had not invited him into. In 2011, a small, strange opportunity arrived, in the form of what was supposed to be a minor cameo. The hit comedy series The Office was nearing the end of its 7th season, and the producers wanted a memorable guest for the final episodes. The offer was for a single appearance at the tail end of the season, 1 episode, possibly 2, a fun little punctuation mark at the end of a long run. The character they had in mind was a job applicant named Robert California. The plan was simple. He would walk into the office, say something strange, perhaps get hired or perhaps not, and then the credits would roll. Spader said yes. What happened next is the kind of thing television executives tell their grandchildren about. From the moment he appeared on screen, the role began to outgrow its container. The performance was razor sharp in a way comedy rarely allows. Every blink, every pause, every carefully measured shift in his warm, deliberate voice carried a humor that was unsettling and hilarious at the same time. Robert California did not behave like a job applicant. He behaved like a man who had walked into a branch office, surveyed the entire staff in a single glance, and calmly decided that the company now belonged to him. Somewhere around the first table read, the producers realized what the audience would realize weeks later, that they had hired the wrong person for the wrong number of episodes in the wrong size of role. The character was expanded. The single-episode cameo turned into a major recurring presence throughout the entire 8th season. Spader walked in as a guest star and left, again, having quietly rearranged the furniture of a long-running hit. The most ambitious chapter of this late career reinvention began in 2013. The Blacklist was built around one of the great audacious premises in modern network television. Its central character, Raymond Reddington, walked into FBI headquarters under his own power and surrendered to the United States government. He was, by every public measure available, the most wanted criminal on the face of the earth, a former intelligence operative who had spent decades transforming himself into a criminal mastermind operating across continents. And yet here he was, calmly offering himself up to the Bureau, promising to help them hunt down some of the most dangerous fugitives in the world, on one condition. He would only do it his way. He would only talk to one particular rookie profiler. He would only follow his own rules. And he would only stay as long as the deal still interested him. Most actors would have played the part as a loud, bristling villain. Reddington was a role that almost demanded a kind of contained thunder. Spader turned him into something else entirely, a man who ruled through words, who transformed long, complicated explanations into captivating stories, who savored each sentence the way a connoisseur slowly turns a glass of fine wine on the tongue. He did not need to threaten. He did not need to swing a fist or fire a weapon to dominate a room. He simply spoke, and the rest of the cast and the entire audience leaned in to listen. The Blacklist ran for 10 seasons and produced more than 200 episodes. Spader earned 2 additional Golden Globe nominations for the performance. A character that began as a high-concept thriller idea became one of the defining television presences of its decade, and it did so without ever surrendering its unsettling, anti-heroic strangeness. If by this point anyone in the industry still believed they had James Spader figured out, the next development would have cured them of that idea. The reach of his strange, hypnotic authority extended all the way to the very top of the global entertainment industry. In 2015, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, at that point already a billion-dollar-a-year enterprise built on the largest contracts in the history of Hollywood, came looking. The director, Joss Whedon, selected Spader to voice the villainous robotic intelligence known as Ultron in Avengers: Age of Ultron. The role, on paper, was a digital creation, a computer-generated menace, a thing of polygons and rendered light. Spader treated it as anything but. He did not stand in a recording booth and read lines into a microphone. He wore a specialized motion capture suit from head to toe. He used his own body, his own walk, his own rhythm of breathing. The performance was then translated frame by frame into the metallic frame of a villain that audiences would watch on screens the size of small buildings around the world. The result was not the cold, robotic villain the special effects reels typically produce. Ultron moved like a person. He spoke with a sarcasm that cut, a bitterness that simmered, a rage that suggested a creature aware of its own artificial nature and furious about it. He felt disturbingly, almost uncomfortably human. The film earned $1.4 billion worldwide, the largest and most commercially successful project Spader had ever been part of, by an order of magnitude larger than anything that had come before. He had arrived, in the most undeniable terms the modern industry can offer, at the very top. And yet, even at the top, the pattern held. The character's popularity became significant enough that audiences now expect to see him return. A project called Vision Quest, currently expected for release in 2026, is widely understood to mark the next chapter in the Ultron story, a development that suggests a digital villain voiced by a Boston actor in a motion capture suit may outlive, in cultural memory, almost every live-action role he has played. So what does the accumulation actually look like when you lay it out? A Brat Pack-era villain who used beauty as a weapon. The Cannes triumph that bought him freedom instead of fortune. 2 decades of films most leading men would not touch. 3 Emmys in 4 years for a single character across 2 shows. A single episode cameo that swallowed an entire television season. A 10-season, 200-episode crime saga built around his voice. A villain inside the largest grossing film franchise on Earth. The receipts, in other words, are extraordinary. They are also strangely beside the point. Because somewhere behind all of those roles, accumulating the way interest accumulates in a quiet account, there's a much harder thing to see. The billion-dollar franchise does not explain the man. The 3 Emmys do not explain the man. The 10 seasons of The Blacklist, the Cannes Trophy, the Ultron mask worn in a motion capture suit, none of it explains the boy from Boston who once sat in a polished prep school and understood, at 17, that he was not going to inherit the future everyone else had drafted for him. To find that boy, you have to look somewhere the cameras were not pointed. You have to look at the private geography of a man who has spent 40 years building characters for the screen while constructing, with equal care, a much more private architecture for himself. The next chapter is not about what he built in public. It is about the architecture behind it, the rules, the rituals, the silences, the very particular kind of distance that a man like Spader builds between himself and the world that keeps trying to make him its product. The strangest thing about the career we have just walked through is not any single role. It is that the man who played all of them has remained, even at the peak of his fame, fundamentally invisible. The camera turns off, the lights cool down, and the man who was, moments earlier, Ultron in a billion-dollar franchise, or Reddington commanding an entire FBI task force, walks back to his trailer. The screen door closes. The world outside the set keeps moving at full speed. Interviews requested, photographs demanded, opinions solicited, fans studied, gossip collected. James Spader, by every reliable account, almost never opens that trailer door. The industry that built its largest enterprises around his face has spent decades trying to figure out what is behind it. And the man himself has, with extraordinary consistency, refused to participate in that figuring out. He is an exceptionally private person. He has never used social media. He does not maintain a public account of any kind on any platform that has emerged in the 20 years since those platforms took over the culture. Personal interviews are rare, and when he does agree to one, his answers tend to drift toward philosophical reflection rather than the kind of personal disclosure that builds a glossy magazine profile. Ask him about his private life, and you often get a careful rephrasing of the question, or a small, deliberate change of subject that feels more like a polite door being closed than a deflection. In an era when fame is built on the constant, voluntary broadcast of the self, James Spader has essentially chosen to disappear between projects. He lets the work speak. He does not, in any meaningful sense, speak alongside it. His process as an actor explains part of that temperament, and it is itself a kind of private architecture. For Spader, the work is not about surrendering to explosive emotion or mining his own psychology in front of a camera. It is closer to a technical problem solved carefully, piece by piece. He builds a character from the outside in. First the appearance, how the character stands, how he holds his hands, what he chooses to wear and what he chooses to refuse. Then the mannerisms, the small, repeatable behaviors that make a person recognizable in a room before they have spoken a word. Then the voice, its register, its speed, its hesitations. Only after all of those mechanical elements are in place does he begin to connect them to the inner life of the character. It is the approach of an engineer assembling the components of a complex machine, and it produces performances that look, from the outside, almost too precise to be human. The precision is, of course, precisely the point. He has also made a series of very deliberate choices about where he lives, choices that say more than any interview ever could. Los Angeles, where the entertainment elite networks and the industry lives within a few square miles of freeway, would have been the obvious home for a man of his stature. Spader has instead chosen the quieter, faster, more anonymous geography of New York. He has described himself, in the few unguarded moments he permits, as someone who deeply values privacy. The constant social demands of Hollywood, the parties, the premieres, the dinners that function as networking, exhaust him. They are performances he did not audition for, and he has simply stopped accepting the role. The financial picture, for what it is worth, reflects the discipline of the career rather than the wild luck of it. His net worth is estimated at around $20 million, a substantial sum by any ordinary measure, and yet a small one by the standards of the franchise stars who share his generation. He made his money the way he made his art, by staying selective, by protecting his time, by treating every choice as something that had to be earned. His personal life has followed a similar pattern of deliberate quiet. After his marriage to Victoria Keel ended in divorce in 2004, he entered a long-term relationship with Leslie Ann Stevenson, which has now lasted more than 2 decades. Together they have built a quiet household that includes his 3 sons, 2 from his first marriage, and 1 from the relationship with Stevenson. There have been no major personal scandals, no public feuds, no tabloid headlines that required apologies or public statements. In an industry that treats private lives as fuel for public entertainment, that record is itself a kind of defiance. Beneath all of this, the privacy, the selectivity, the precise smallness of the public footprint, there is one struggle that Spader has discussed openly in exactly one carefully chosen setting. In a 2014 interview with Rolling Stone magazine, he spoke with remarkable candor about living with obsessive-compulsive disorder. He did not frame it as a confession, and he did not frame it as a call for sympathy. He discussed it with the calm practicality of a man who had spent decades learning how to live and work alongside it, the same way a sailor learns to live with a long-running wind. The admission did not become a story. It did not become a public narrative. It sat in the interview, was reported on once, and then the world moved on, because the world moves on from almost everything. That is exactly the point. By the time he reached his 60s, Spader had achieved something that very few performers ever reach, and that almost no franchise star ever reaches. He had complete artistic freedom. He could choose his projects. He could refuse the ones he did not want. He could spend a year away from the screen and return without apology. His career, now spanning more than 4 decades, has left behind not just an impressive collection of performances, but a specific, lasting effect on the shape of the medium itself. He played a major role in establishing the modern television archetype of the anti-hero, the intelligent, manipulative, deeply human character that audiences now follow as a matter of course, the kind of figure embodied so famously by Walter White in Breaking Bad or Don Draper in Mad Men. The morally compromised, endlessly watchable protagonist that contemporary audiences have come to expect as the natural center of a serious drama has a foundation, and Spader helped pour it. He emerged from the wreckage of Hollywood's golden age never aspiring to be the flawless hero, never accepting the contract offered to him, and never apologizing for the refusal. He remained committed, across every decade and across every strange, uncomfortable, magnetic choice, to characters who made audiences uneasy and yet impossible to look away from. That is the legacy in the purest sense of the word. Not a trophy, not a number, but a standard quietly set. And so the final image, the one that stays, is not the red carpet at some Los Angeles premiere. It is not the motion capture stage on which he built a billion-dollar villain. It is not the Cannes stage or the Emmy podium or the long white corridor of an FBI headquarters in the blacklist. The final image, for anyone who has really watched this strange career unfold, is much smaller and much harder to see. It is the trailer with the closed door, the unanswered interview request, the carefully kept distance from a town that would gladly turn every detail of his private life into content. The discipline of a man who, from his very first mop in a New York workshop to his most recent surreal triumph, has understood the difference between being seen and being known, and has chosen, again and again, to be known only to himself and to the small number of people he has personally decided to let in. The thing that lingers is not the $20 million, not the 3 Emmys, not the Palme d'Or standing on some shelf in a private room we will never see. The thing that lingers is the quiet, ordinary, profoundly human struggle of a man who built an entire career on the appearance of total control, while living privately with a mind that requires constant, careful management. Money cannot protect a person from that kind of exhaustion. The highest altitude of fame can sometimes be, for a temperament like his, a self-chosen form of loneliness. It is a price a man like Spader has been willing to pay, decade after decade, in order to keep the last pieces of his identity intact. He does not need to be celebrated as a flawless hero. He has never asked for that, and the work itself never once requested it. What the record does ask, quietly, stubbornly, across more than 40 years, is for a slightly deeper kind of empathy. For an understanding that behind the silk curtain of the bespoke suit, behind the billion-dollar frame of Ultron, behind the slow half-smile of Reddington, there is a real human being who has paid the cost of never quite belonging, who carries within him a condition he has chosen to live with rather than perform for us, and who has earned the right to remain, in the end, just a little out of reach. The role of James Spader, the private man, will never be one we are invited to watch. That is, in its own way, the most deliberate and most disciplined performance of his life.